Yeah, I felt like that the whole time because from the time I was 15 to the time I moved out, I was home. He was not home. So the only time we would really spend together was Game of Thrones Sundays. And that was really it. So the rest of the time was just arguments if he got home or if I was out. I tried to go to my friends' houses as much as possible and spend time over there. Stand your ground as much as you can. And if a law is broken, call the cops because you will not be the one that gets in trouble. I wish I had told myself that so many times. I always feared that, like, my parent, because the incident with my mom, I got her sent to a mental institution, and she's still mad at me for that. And I always feared that they would lie to the cops and have me sent. Or I was in fear of going to foster care because I didn't have another parent. I wish I would have said something to somebody at school. I did not say enough to my teachers, and I wish I would have because I protected my dad a lot. I'd say tell somebody.
This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. That's Chey Vyshnya, the host of True Compass, a podcast that goes beyond the surface in telling true crime stories and is focused on cultivating awareness around many issues. Shay's interest in true crime goes back to when she was a little girl, when she wanted to be a forensic scientist. By the time Shay made it to high school, she switched her focus to law. While in college, Shay dropped out of the University of Houston because she was struggling with mental health issues that she says were causing her to, quote, get really sick. After dropping out and months of doctor's appointments, Shay found out that she actually had hyperPOTS, an illness that results in relapsing and remitting loss of plasma in her blood and surrounding tissue that can lead to fatigue, brain fog, blurred vision, heart palpitations, and a wide variety of other debilitating conditions. She was also diagnosed with a condition associated with POTS known as Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a genetic connective tissue disorder that leads to loose joints, joint pain, skin problems, and other symptoms that can also lead to challenges as severe as scoliosis, chronic pain, joint dislocation, and even aortic dissection. During that same period, Shay also received a diagnosis of autism, which is often underdiagnosed in girls and women. Autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder that includes marked impairment when it comes to social communication and also restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior. People with autism also struggle with common social situations, sensory input, and having a restricted list of interests. Psychiatry has long classified autism as a mental illness, although it might be better looked at through the lens of neurodiversity, which is the natural diversity in human thinking and experience with different strengths and different weaknesses. These diagnoses led Shay to abandon her dreams of finishing school and becoming an attorney because of the challenges of both. While she was in college, Shay constantly listened to true crime podcasts, and her aunt even started one. Shay says she was obsessed, but felt that none of the podcasts she listened to took a Gen Z point of view. After attending an annual true crime podcast event one year and meeting many creators, she realized that she could bring that point of view to the true crime world. Shay also shared mutual friends with Jason Landry, a Texas college student who disappeared under mysterious circumstances on December 13th, 2020. Landry's abandoned vehicle was discovered in the early morning hours on a rural roadway just outside of Luling, Texas, a former boom town in the center of the state that was once known as, quote, the toughest town in Texas. That case is still unsolved. Shay felt her experiences in middle school, high school, and college taught her that being raised by a father who is a Marine and an uncle who is a diplomat gave her many tools and a level of safety and awareness in everyday situations that many of her peers, she felt, didn't possess. Ultimately, that led Shay to start True Compass in her quest to bring a proactive approach to true crime, not just telling the stories of crimes, but also drawing out the lessons that can be learned that can help people stay safe. Today, we're going to discuss the needs of Gen Z, the lessons that can be learned from suffering, and why focusing on safety is not limited to crime, but it's about emotional, psychological, legal, and physical safety, and why she decided to focus on helping people learn ways to stay safe in this world. Hey, Shay. I just wanted to thank you for joining me. I have thoroughly enjoyed listening to your podcast. I tripped across True Compass because of our shared mutual friend, Robert Palmer, who's the host of the Broken System podcast, and somebody that I've had on. And he really encouraged me. He was like, you have to check this podcast out. I know, as a podcaster who spends lots of time interviewing, one of the things that happens is we stop listening as much, or at least I stop listening to others. But he said, this is a voice that you should really hear. And one of the things that really sort of struck me about the work that you were doing within the broader true crime community was that you were focused beyond sort of like, telling the stories of the actual crime, but also sort of exploring what lessons we could learn to keep ourselves and our loved ones safe. And I thought that was like a really, really different approach for a field that's sort of like been criticized for being too focused on the entertainment side. I thought it was interesting you brought that voice, and so I'm thrilled to have you on.
Thank you so much. And that really does mean a lot to me because I did want to not focus on the entertainment side, and I really wanted it to be a place where people could come and actually learn and grow themselves and their knowledge. So, thank you.
Yeah, no, I feel like you've from the very first episode on, I know in your first episode by the end of it, it was a rich, robust discussion about safety and good advice for people, in addition to sort of telling the story. And it's just not something that I'm used to in the space. And it's a really cool opportunity because so many people are interested in true crime in general, but it gives them this added benefit of having something good come out of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, which is very important nowadays with all the negative that's everywhere.
Yeah, surrounding us in this universe. So I was gonna just sort of like step back a little bit. I know we've sort of discussed this in our back and forth, but one of the things that I really found interesting about your story, first of all, you're relatively young as a podcaster. How old are you now?
I'm about to turn 25.
Okay, so you're about to turn 25. But, we had talked about some of the struggles that you have had in life, struggles growing up, struggles in college. And I was just curious about what growing up was like, what your experience sort of like trying to get through college were like. And then also sort of like, suffering at that time with undiagnosed illnesses and trying to push your way through. Just curious about what that whole experience was like to the point where you got your diagnosis is.
Well, growing up, I I was adopted by my stepdad at 8 years old. So I didn't know my real father, and I still don't. I have met my biological sisters. I found them through Facebook, so that was very fun.
Interesting. How'd you find them? What was the Unless they've started uploading DNA to Facebook, I'm not.
No. My mom actually just randomly, it was Thanksgiving of 2018. My mom had told me, oh, by the way, you have a sister that's older than you through your biological father. She gave me a first name and that was it. So I hit Facebook and I started searching and I found her. I messaged her. And then that next day, she messaged me back and said, I've been looking for you for 13 years.
Wow.
Holy crap. And
What did
then
that feel like?
it was insane. So we actually FaceTimed as soon as I got that message. And we were both just bawling in tears. It was surreal. Because I'd only ever had one other sibling and he's 9 years older than me.
Mm.
So having a sister was being able to say, oh, I have a sister was truly incredible. And
Yeah.
as soon as we FaceTimed, she goes, I don't know if this is the right time to tell you, but there was a third.
There are more.
So we ended up finding my little sister's mom on MySpace and then on Facebook, messaged her and found my little sister.
So, in a short period of time, she had gone from 13 years of searching you to having found you. You had gone from not knowing you had any sisters to knowing that you had one sister that you found and then a second sister. Like, all of this is happening over a matter of days, weeks.
It took us 24 hours total.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That how do you think that did that change your perspective on things or
Oh,
your life experience?
absolutely. I definitely have a different view of family than most people because I didn't grow up with my siblings, and I didn't know my dad from when I was really young. So I don't have any baby pictures with my dad and stuff like that. And that's always been kind of hard for both
Yeah.
me and my dad. But whenever I found my sister, it was kind of bittersweet for both my dad and me because my dad realized, oh, this person got to interact with my child as a baby when I did
Mm.
not. And that was kind of hard to overcome. But we
Yeah.
eventually did. And yeah, just definitely changed my outlook on family. And then I always think there's another one out there, possibly, even though we have no proof of it.
Yeah. Well,
But yeah, I'm always on the lookout and I'm always like, "Oh, I've gotten really good at looking at faces because of it. Because when I was looking through every single Bailey I could find on the internet,
that
I
was her first name or Bailey?
yeah, my
Yeah.
sister's name.
Wow.
So as soon as I found one that, I looked at a picture of my DNA donor and I looked at a picture of whoever was on the screen and I was like, nope, that's not it. And that's how I got really good at seeing faces and if people are related. And now it's like a special party trick of mine.
What was it? What was it that told you when you saw her picture? What was it that made you say that's the one?
Her smile was
Mm.
first. Me and her have the same exact smile. It's a
Mm.
little bit too small for our face.
Mm.
And our dad had the same exact one. And that was it. And then our eyes are the same color.
Oh, wow.
And then the first time we ended up meeting in person, we were writing things down, like just like jotting things down. I forget what it was for. But we looked at it and we have the same exact handwriting.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I've heard those stories of, I remember there was this experiment that was done with twins. And, it probably wasn't the world's most ethical experiment, but it was in New York, I think, maybe New York and
Yes,
Pennsylvania.
the
Yep.
adoption agencies.
Yes, correct. And that some of those twins then later met, having never lived with each other and had similar mannerisms.
Yeah, so me and my sister, we have similar mannerisms, similar ways we walk.
Hmm.
Um, we both write the same way. We have similar taste in food, and we didn't grow up with each other.
Wow. That's where did they grow up? Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in the Dallas area. She kind of moved around. She was in Oklahoma mainly and Chicago area.
Mm-hmm.
And my little sister's always been in San Antonio area.
Okay. Okay. That's wild. That's such a wild thing to just even notice the same taste in foods. And it kind of reminds me of the idea that like we're all more connected, like in your example, in a biological way, but we are really more connected as people than we think, and you never really know.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. And it's been really cool to like just get to know each other
yeah.
because I mean, as siblings, you usually know everything about each other. And with us, it's like strangers. Like our little sister, she's very quiet, she's very introverted. So we haven't got to spend much time with her yet. But like me and my older sister, we just get along very well. And it's like we have never left each other's side when we're together. So it's pretty cool to
Yeah,
watch.
that is awesome. So this is sort of like around. So how old are you at that time? This is 2018.
Yeah, I'm
So
19 at
26.
that
So you're
point.
19 at that point, and you find out, wow. So are you in college at that point where you're figuring this
Yes.
out?
So
Okay.
I went to college in Corpus Christi first. When I was in Corpus Christi, I got pretty depressed and I got down to a very low weight. And so I decided it would be best for me to switch colleges. So I packed up everything and moved
Were
to
you
Houston.
at the Texas A&M campus that was there?
Yes.
Yeah, so my mom, when she was working on her educational PhD and we were living in Houston, she took classes there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's a
so
beautiful
it's
campus.
gorgeous. Yeah.
I absolutely loved it. Besides some of the people there, ex-boyfriends.
Right. Yes.
Um,
Yes.
so I packed up. I went to Houston, which was closer to my sister, who lived in Houston at the time. And so we could hang out. So I went to Houston. I joined a student government campaign. So we were running for student government elections. And I was the social media manager for that. I was studying political science and law. When I dropped out, I had finished my law minor and
Hmm.
was about, let me do some math, 2 semesters away from graduating.
Okay.
And I got really sick. I dropped a lot of weight again 2 years later. And so I dropped out. I started going to the doctors a bunch, and we figured
What
out.
was it like for you when you were there? So you're 2 semesters away. You're really close. And was it physical pain that started, or was
Well,
it like
2020 was my junior year of college. So when the pandemic hit, I was a junior in college. But around in the middle of like year 2, 3, and for hours wise. So I had to move back home during the pandemic, but I was still doing classes. And those classes are hard whenever you're online. I don't think a lot of the older generation understands how much more difficult that made college for us younger generation.
unless they were teaching their kids at home during the time,
Yeah,
it was
yeah,
a nightmare. Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So it was just awful. I've got to say, those classes were hell. It was 12 hours a day for every single class. You had to do work. So I was just exhausted physically, mentally, emotionally. By the time COVID had ended, like that first semester of COVID had ended. And then I was starting again that next semester,
So
still
this
at
is the
home.
fall of 2020.
Yeah,
Yeah.
still at home, still living with my dad. And me and my dad were fighting all the time. So it was just really hard to focus on those classes and to have to deal with a a drunk.
Yeah.
And
And all the anxiety that existed simply because of the pandemic and all the changes, like you're
yeah,
talking about the classes. I mean, I think it was super stressful for most people, but it sounds like it was particularly hard for you.
yeah, and my dad's a single dad, so it's and to him, I'm his only child, so it's not like I had anybody to help me or to back me up when I was with him. So it's really just a one-on-one 24/7 when you're in a house with somebody like that.
Sort of already isolated by the pandemic and then isolated
Yeah.
even more by not having anybody else at home other than him.
Yeah, so I finally left. I went to my uncle's in Oklahoma, and I did my next spring semester of 2021 there. But while I was there, as soon as I got away from my dad, I just shut down. My body just wanted to sleep all the time. It was just I couldn't get up. If I did get up, I was nauseous.
Mm.
And then my pain just everywhere, all over my body every day. And I was like, I can't do this anymore. So I called my mom. I told her what was going on. She was like, okay, drop out of school. We'll get you back home. And so I did. And I went back home. She took me to a ton of doctors, and we finally got a diagnosis that I had hyperadrenergic POTS, and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And whenever we went to go get my mental health assessment done, they were like, "You're autistic," and I was like, "Cool."
You're like, this is starting to make sense.
Yeah. So everything just kind of like came together, and life made sense again. And yeah,
At
I
least
re-
you had something to do, if that makes sense, to do about it instead of
yeah.
just being in
So
pain.
I was able to, like after a couple months, I went no contact with my dad. And then after a couple months, I told him about my diagnosis and that I dropped out of college and everything. So I've told him, and he was like, okay, I get it. I understand. When are you going to go back to school? And I was like, that's not in the books anymore, dude.
Yeah. It sounds like that was a real long road.
Yeah. So I just decided I'm gonna try to work. So I worked for a little bit at a bakery. And I was like, nope, I can't do this.
Was it the physical part of it that was difficult or?
Yeah. So I was passing out at the bakery
Wow.
and throwing up and having to run to the bathroom. And it was just awful.
And you kept on trying?
Yeah,
You're a fighter.
I kept trying, which like all throughout high school, I worked 3 jobs.
Wow.
College, I worked. So I was a nanny in college, and I was just always listening to true crime podcasts. So once I figured out I couldn't do anything physically, I was like, you know what? I'll throw myself into the true crime world. I already love it. So might as well. And here I am today.
Yeah, you said something interesting before. You said that you were diagnosed with the autism diagnosis, and it was like you woohoo. And one of the interesting things that I found in like working with people with autism or even people with ADHD is even though it's in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This is a simple test for me. I
Yeah.
always ask myself, if everyone had this illness in society, quote unquote, and everyone had this illness, and would the people who have it be able to function in the world? So, like, I'm diagnosed with bipolar.
Hmm.
If everyone had bipolar, we would not have a very functioning world. It would be a pretty wild world. It would be a fun world, but it would
Yeah.
not be a particularly functioning world. But the thing for people with autism or ADHD is it's just because it's outside of the normative, it's outside of the norm is why we sort of look at it as diagnose it as an illness. But if everyone had autism or everyone had ADHD, they would be the ones functioning and we would not be the ones functioning in the society that they created. So I tend to think while there are elements that, where treatment is appropriate and helpful, autism is way more about like just neurodiversity, like that idea that, some people are left-handed, some people are right-handed, some people process things in a certain way, or they make social connections in different ways. And, so when you said woohoo that you found the diagnosis, 20 years ago, I would have run into a lot more people who it would have felt like the end of the world for them, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
For me, it was pretty relieving because, like, as a young child, I had a really hard time making friends, and I was always bullied for liking weird things, and I was a gymnast, so I was just weird in general because we are locked in a gym for 40 hours a week. So being a weird kid, I was just bullied a ton, and I finally realized why whenever I got that diagnosis, and I understood a lot more about, like, sensory needs whenever I got that diagnosis and stuff like that.
Things like overstimulation by
Yeah.
sensory items. Tell me more about that.
So, when I was little, my family I remember, like, my mom and my dad would buy me sweaters when I was little, and they would be so itchy, and I'd hate wearing them, and they'd
Mm.
be so mad because they'd buy me all these expensive clothes, and I'd hate wearing them. But I realized I couldn't go to school in that because I would have an absolute meltdown. And if I did, or if I went out in that, I would always have a meltdown and they'd wonder like why I'm being so whiny or like whatever. And I finally understood like I was overstimulated. It wasn't how I was behaving. It's just I was
It's
not
not
in the
that you were too sensitive or that something psychologically was going wrong with you. It's that
yeah.
yeah.
It
You're going through an experience that other people wearing that sweater are not.
Yeah, so I was just overstimulated and I finally like realized, "Oh my god, just that makes sense." And then another big thing was food textures. There was one thing I remember from my childhood. We were at the original Pancake House, which if anybody in Dallas is listening, you know what I'm talking about. And my dad had ordered orange juice for us and it had pulp in it. And I was gagging the whole time, but he made me drink that orange juice. And
Mm.
I was, like, gagging and about to throw up the whole time, and as soon as I got that diagnosis, I was like, "It wasn't me."
Yeah, because textures is another thing, like sensitivity to textures or even touching certain surfaces.
Yeah, like, microfiber's a big one for me, gross fleece. I think people know what I'm talking
Interesting.
about, like,
Yeah.
weird blankets, fleece
Hmm.
blankets, I hate that.
The big heavy ones with the fleece on the outside. Yeah.
Yeah,
The
but
so it ultimately ended up being like eye opening for you because you were able to like one put so much from your past into context, but probably also like giving yourself permission on some level to like, you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah,
Just
like,
not.
being able to be myself more often, that was a big thing for me 'cause, when I was little, I was always really excited over things, and my parents are introverts. My dad's a Marine, and, they're "I'm gonna stay in my lane" kinda people.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, I would always get really excited, and my dad would have to tell me to calm down and, like, act like a lady or whatnot, so allowing myself to get excited over things again has been really fun.
Yeah.
Um
Well, and that's also one of the things like a lot of people with autism sort of like get criticized for like what we would call restricted interests, right? Like having very narrow interests that can look like obsession. And one of the things I've noticed with my clients, like people will try to get them to sort of like broaden their aperture and diversify and not do this one thing that they're really interested in. And when they get the autism diagnosis, like almost all the parents are like, oh, oops, like
Yeah.
I kind of screwed up here because, and then I think it's like very freeing for the person who gets the diagnosis. Like, I am interested in Magic the Dragon or
Well,
whatever it
like
is.
before
And
Game of Thrones became big, I was a huge Game of Thrones fan. My parents allowed me to start watching when it first came out. I was 11 years old. They would watch it on Sundays, and on Mondays I would watch, and they would fast forward through the sex scenes until my parents got divorced, and then my dad and I would watch it on Sundays together. And if you could see in the camera right now, I have a ton of Game of Thrones stuff around me, and my dogs are also named after Game of Thrones.
what
So
are their names? What are their names?
I have Arya and I have Kira.
Ah, Kieran. All right, good choices. So, are you a Jon Snow fan or are you a Jon Snow management fan?
I am an Arya and Tyrion fan through and through.
Okay, so we have that in common. I do love Tyrion's little mind and his trickery, and Arya is just my hero. So
Yeah.
we share that in common. It's very funny. Everybody told me before I saw Game of Thrones that I'm like Littlefinger, and I'll love that. I was like, no, you guys are so wrong. Tyrion is my man, and I want to marry Arya.
Yeah. So I actually, whenever the show started, me and Bran were the same age.
Oh wow.
So I pretty
And
much
that's
grew up with those Stark kids, if I really think about it. And that's been really cool to
you were like
have.
their little sister as the Starks are growing up.
Yeah,
Like,
because
yeah.
I don't think there's another fan that's my age that was watching since the beginning. And I think that's something really special that me and my dad have forever. And I'm grateful for that.
Yeah. So you were saying along this time, like one of your interests became true crime. When did you start to get interested in that? I know you had mentioned to me once that you had thought about becoming a forensic scientist when you were younger and sort of switched to the law. Like, how did your interest in true crime even start?
So when I was really little, actually, my a babysitter who lived with us at the time, her boyfriend was murdered. And I remember that being like my first kind of step into the true crime world personally. And I remember how much that affected my mom and affected her.
What happened?
Um, you can look it up. It's called the Truett Street Murders in McKinney, Texas. It was basically a robbery gone wrong, and her boyfriend had just not been at the wrong place at the wrong time.
Hmm.
Yeah, and
I'm sorry.
it was really hard for her, and it still is for her. So, um,
How old were you at the time?
I was probably 2 or 3 years old, and I remember the cops and the media being all there. So that was really my first kind of step into true crime. But as long as I can remember, my mom had always watched Law and Order SVU. So I was always interested in that. I would always watch it with her. So I fell in love with Olivia Benson, and from that moment on, I was like, okay, I'm going to be a forensic scientist. I said that at like age 8. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to be a mortician. And then I want to say my sophomore year of high school, or going into my sophomore year of high school, we were picking classes for the next year. And I saw that there was a law track and in my school district, and there was a forensic track. So I took all the classes needed for both of those. I did constitutional law that year, and then I did like an overview of law enforcement, just like basic general overview. And then that next year, I did all the rest of the classes. And then my senior year, I did forensic science, I did law enforcement, I did mock trial. anything you can imagine. So when I got to college, I felt very prepared and like I had a lot of knowledge. And then I found True Crime Podcast my sophomore year of college. I was like, okay, this is fun. I have 9 hours to drive. I could listen to this while I'm driving to college. So that's what I
Mm.
did, and I got obsessed. Hell and Gone was the first one I listened to, and I'm still obsessed with Catherine Townsend.
What's that? What's the Hell and Gone podcast?
Catherine Townsend is an investigative journalist who focuses on like smaller cases that you've never heard of out of small towns, usually in Arkansas.
Oh,
She
neat.
did one in Kill Devil Hills, North Carolina, also.
Mm.
But that was the first podcast that I got listening to, and I think the investigative journalism. I love investigative journalism. It's one of my favorites to watch on television. It's one of my favorites to listen to on podcast. And yeah, so I fell in love with that. And then I started expanding into more podcast and more podcast. And then my senior year of college, Amanda, my aunt, started her own. So I worked on hers for a little bit. And yeah,
What did you do when you were working on hers?
I did some social media stuff. I did
Oh,
some
nice.
graphics and helped with some of the funner episodes, like the ones that they would do for their Patreon and stuff like that.
Oh, neat, neat, neat. So you really were able to get your hands in it. Like one of the things that really sort of like stood out to me about your podcast was like the ability to focus on awareness, right? And one of the threads that I saw, because when I was listening to the first few episodes, like what was very clear to me was that you were building awareness, but I found this kind of thread through it and thread through what you talk about in general and your social media presence and other places. It's very much about safety, but it's not just about like physical safety from crime. Like you touch on things like emotional safety, psychological safety, like abuse, for
Yeah.
example. You also you've had, our friend Bob Mata, the Defense Diaries host and criminal
Hmm.
defense attorney. And you guys were essentially talking about the law, but you were really talking about like legal safety, constitutional rights, and protections. And I just found this thread about
A
wanting
lot
to
of a
keep.
lot of those questions with Bob were just some of my personal, like, I wanted to know.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, no, no. I believe you. But what I was curious about, like just in running through that line of things and topics, like what is it that drives you to want to make the world safer for people?
I think after my parents' divorce, I didn't feel safe um, wherever I was, and I wanted that for other people. I didn't want anybody else to feel be in a situation that they feel like they cannot get out of. And
Hmm.
that's a big drive for me. Is thinking about other people that may be going through similar situations that don't have the guidance or the help or somebody to lean on in those situations. So I think being able to be that voice and kind of give somebody some guidance that nobody else may have a perspective on is very important, especially in today's world where people are cruel and we have to deal with generations that don't understand my generation. And a lot of kids don't have that family that makes them feel safe. So if I
Hmm.
could allow them to have some knowledge to make themselves feel more secure in their lives, that's my whole goal.
Okay. That makes sense. So like what was it? You mentioned the generational piece of it, but you also mentioned that idea of like creating safety. Were those two of the things that you thought were sort of missing and maybe even beyond true crime podcasting and maybe more broadly in society, like that focus on sort of helping people and giving them the tools they need and also sort of speaking in a voice that really represented like your generation?
Yeah, I think I realized with a lot of my high school teachers, they taught me so much, and I still speak to a lot of them every single week at least. But yeah, those teachers, they just taught me how to communicate, and they made me feel safe by giving me knowledge. And there's got to give a shout out to my Ewalds, my mock trial coach, and my mock trial teacher. They really pushed me to stand up towards adults. They taught me how to do that, and I've got to give them credit for that because without them, I don't think I would have been able to get through high school in general or let alone college. So yeah, being able to just stand up to adults was definitely helped. I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah, no, it does. Because it sort of sounds like what you're saying is like you almost didn't get at home that sense of safety that you're trying to give other people. But these teachers in your life were able to give you some of that, like strength, safety, tools, knowledge that allowed you to keep yourself like a little bit safe. Do you think that the things that they sort of taught you and helped you with were part of what gave you the strength to kind of walk away from your dad?
Absolutely. I also think podcast helped a lot of that. Around the time I left my dad's house, I had started listening to A Little Bit Culty by Sarah and Nippy.
What's
And
that about?
they are Nixium whistleblowers that started their own podcast about cult survivors and stuff like
And
that.
Nixium was like one of those scam slash cult slash
Yeah,
groups,
they were
right?
like a new age philosophy cult,
Yeah, I
I
remember
guess.
reading about them. They
And
had
then it
gotten
became a
into legal
sex
trouble.
cult.
Yep.
Yeah. So I listened to their podcast and they and watching The Vow in general, both of those kind of allowed me to see narcissism and
What was the
how
vow? What was the vow?
it's the documentary about Nixium.
Nixium. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, watching those and listening to their episodes, allowed me to see what narcissism is. And I also found a couple of TikTokers that were alcoholics or recovering alcoholics. And they were able to like give me just like some ideas of like, okay, this is from alcoholism and this is from narcissism. And being able to point those two out and then finally being able to be like, okay, being able to focus on myself and not have to be a parent to my parent, especially in my 20s. I really needed to do that. And so, yeah, we got in a huge fight on during the Snowmageddon of 2021. And that's when I left.
Is that when Texas got like a drop of snow and shut down? As I
Well,
recall.
we
Or
actually
is that
had
the
like
one where the power went out?
the power went out.
That's when the power went out. Yeah.
Yeah. So, my dad was drinking that whole time and we were fighting that whole time. And I was trying to get students, because I was working on the campaign, I was trying to get students into warm housing and on the phone with Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, trying to get these students into warm housing and get them food and water. And as I'm doing that, I'm being screamed at the whole time. So I just couldn't take it anymore. I left that night. I sent him a message that night and said, look, if you want to speak to me, you can write me a letter. You can email me. I don't care. But
Was
I
it
need
like
some
a
time.
contrast? Like you were sitting there trying to help people, but he's yelling at you about things that like you perceive to be selfish, and you're like, wait a second, hold on.
Yeah, it was pretty much just like I'm just over being a punching bag for everything because like he's not been able to keep a job in the last couple years and just everything was piling on top of me, on top of him. So I just needed to get out. I couldn't take it anymore. I just couldn't take him coming home drunk anymore. And like, I just needed to get out and be able to think on my own, because everything I would say, it was counteracted with, no, this is where I'm right. So I just wanted to be able to like find myself. And yeah.
What did you mean by, like, when you said, and I don't think any kid should have to do this. And I know you made the point that like at 20, you shouldn't have to be a parent, but definitely at like 10 and 15, you shouldn't have to be a parent. What did you mean by having to parent your father?
It was actually kind of both of my parents.
Mm,
I left my mom's house at 15 after an incident with her, and I never moved back in. So I really only had my dad. And whenever you are parenting parents, what I mean by that is I'm having to teach them lessons every day that they should be teaching me.
mm,
And that was a very hard conclusion that I had to come to. And I've kind of had to learn how to reparent myself now, especially with the autism diagnosis. Like
mm.
I'm learning how to be myself and express joy in the way I want to. And so, yeah, it's been a journey.
Right, right. And like a heavy burden, because I think that,
Another part of that is whenever I was parenting my dad, I was always taking him to and from the bar, which
mm,
I felt like if
you're
I
the one
didn't,
picking him up.
yeah. So if I didn't, I'd have to bail him out of jail, which would be even worse for me.
And so it
So
becomes this cycle of, if I don't do this thing that I shouldn't really be doing, I'll have to
yeah,
do this thing that's worse than what I. So did you feel like at some point, like, I'm enabling madness?
yeah, I felt like that the whole time,
Yeah.
because like I was, from the time I was 15 to the time I moved out, I was home. He was not home. So the only time we would really spend together was Game of Thrones Sundays. And that was really it. So the rest of the time was just arguments if he got home, or if I was out. I tried to go to my friends' houses as much as possible and spend time over there.
What message would you have for like kids right now who are sort of sitting at home, like you, sort of in, even though you weren't an only child, in an only child situation with a parent that is somehow abusive? Like, is there any advice you'd have for them?
Stand your ground as much as you can, and if a law is broken, call the cops, because you will not be the one that gets in trouble. I wish I had told myself that
Is that
so many
something you
times.
feared, or?
Yeah, I always feared that, like, my parent, because the incident with my mom, I got her sent to a mental institution.
Hmm.
And she's still mad at me for that. And I always feared that they would lie to the cops and have me sent. So,
Away?
yeah. Or I was in fear of going to foster care because I didn't have another parent. So,
Yeah. And I think kids in those situations just feel like they have so few options.
yeah. And also, I wish I would have said something to somebody at school.
Yep.
I did
Each.
not say enough to my teachers, and I wish I would have, because I protected my dad a lot. And yeah, I'd say tell somebody.
I always think that's a tip off. If you find yourself protecting your parent, you know what I mean? Holding their secrets or protecting them from other adults, it's a tip off that
Yeah.
something is very wrong. One of the things I was just thinking about is, like, you've gone through, by the time you get to college, a lot of really tough stuff already.
Yeah.
You've got these emerging sort of like physical symptoms coming on, and you know, it sounds like, just based on what you're saying, by family history, by physical things, by, or I guess family history is the wrong word for it, but the history of your nuclear family,
Yeah.
um, that it was inevitable that this would become too much of a mental weight. How did it affect you?
I still am learning how to deal with a lot of the trauma every day. So I'll be honest. I did self harm for a long time, and just I don't know how to explain it, but like being able to feel physical pain whenever you're emotionally hurting
Hmm.
really kind of like allowed me to understand like why I was feeling that way. I don't know how if
Oh
that's a good
no,
way to explain it.
it makes perfect sense, because I think a lot of people have lots of misconceptions about self-harm, and like the common misconception is that self-harm is attention seeking. But what we know from the research and the science and the clinical experience is that most self-harm, if you think about it, you're a 15-year-old kid, you need permission to go to the bathroom. Like, you need to actually get a pass
Yeah.
to go to the bathroom. You don't have a car, you can't drive, you have control over very little except for your body.
Yeah.
That's the one thing you can control. And your options are, self harm can come in lots of forms. It can come in not eating, for example. It can come in high risk physical activities while playing sports. It can come in cutting. It can come in lots of different ways, but to some extent, it's very much about control. And then the other thing we know about physically self harming, and I remember this moment when I was a kid and I was running in this field near our house, and we were playing a game of hide and seek, and I ran into barbed wire from an old farm
Oh.
that had been there, and it cut open the front of my leg. And everyone was like, "Good Lord, are you okay?" And I was standing up and I was just fine, because all the adrenaline, all the cortisol, everything was rushing to my body. And later, as I got into mental health, I realized what I just got when my body reacted to that was a giant painkiller and a giant antidepressant. And
Yeah.
that, we know when people cut, it mimics in a way the same things that you get from antidepressants. Now, the downside is you can physically harm yourself, unlike most antidepressants. But there's a real rational reason why people self harm, very much about, like, and that's why you have so many people who self-harm during their teenage years, or years where they don't have a sense of control. And as they develop a little bit more control over more things, that behavior often fades away. And I'm glad you brought it up, because I think it's a topic that there are so many misconceptions around, which get in the way of actually helping the real issues that people are struggling through in those moments.
Yeah, and you talked about other forms of self-harm too. And in college, I took a LGBTQ class that basically explained the history of gay and lesbian culture, and it was very eye-opening and very interesting, and I loved it.
Mm.
And there, I learned about demisexuality, and I learned that I was demisexual, which is you only feel a sexual arousal if you have an emotional attachment.
Well, you're one of two people on this call who fit that same definition. Did I tell you that?
No.
I have an episode a bonus episode where I talk about realizing, you know, through an assortment of things, some friends, but like, my ex, she was my partner for like 10 years. We grew up when we were, we met each other when we were 14, and then in our 30s, we got back together. And she used to say toward the end of a relationship that you're asexual. And I was like, that's a funny joke, right? And I'm like, ha, 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 ha. And so years later, when I told her, I'm like, I am demisexual, I figured out, she's like, you're just figuring it out because the rest of us already did a long time ago.
Yeah, so I learned about demisexuality, and as a teenager, I would often, you know, experiment, I guess is the word, or just like,
Mhm.
sleep around.
Yeah.
And I wasn't
Trying to
emotionally attached
feel
to.
the same thing that everybody else is.
Yeah,
And
but like kind of get control of my body, I guess, because I didn't have control when I was home. So when I was out, I did have control of myself. And I guess that's kind of the reason. But yeah, I would sleep around even though I wasn't attracted to these people, and it would physically hurt. And yeah, that, I guess that's another way of self-harm. And I
yeah.
always noticed that it was like an outlet for me, like when I was younger, because being autistic and demisexual, I didn't, and not knowing about those things as a teenager, I was wild. So
Mhm.
being able to figure out why I didn't enjoy it when I was supposed to, and like it all made sense. So I was like,
Yeah.
okay.
And also why you still did it, to your point of the like self-harm, this thing where, because I think maybe people have a hard time understanding it, but you're not really gonna, without emotional intimacy, really be able to have what people traditionally consider sexual attraction.
Yeah.
And so to do something like that probably fits within that same category. One of the things that really strikes me about you, Shay, in general, both in this interview and your podcast and pretty much any interaction I see you having, is like your willingness to be so unbelievably vulnerable, to kind of like bare yourself. Is there a reason for that? I feel it's very intentional on your part.
I feel like a lot of that is the autism. I'm very bad at lying. Um, so it's very easy for me to be brutally honest. That's part of the thing with autism. A lot of us are very brutally honest, and it gets us in trouble a lot.
It
Uh,
also helps because we're never wondering about where you stand. So that is one upside.
yeah, but so that's helped a ton. And also, I think not enough people are genuine anymore. And
What do you mean by genuine?
like, I don't know, like whenever I was in college, I met a lot of people that I would tell them like little glimpses of my story, and then they'd open up to me. And I think being able to be vulnerable to other people allows them to be vulnerable with you. And if everybody would be vulnerable, the world would be a much better place.
There would be so many more bridges between us.
Yeah.
There would be so many more um, bridges between us. And someone once said to me, they were listening to me talk about something that's just so natural to me, which is like my time at the New York Times and fabrication and plagiarism that I did there. And they said, you talk about it so openly and you so own it that it opened the door for me to talk about some of what they perceive to be the worst mistakes that they made. And I felt like in that moment, as this person was telling me this, we were sitting down at a dinner. I was like, okay, whole podcast, all the hours of working, all the other pieces to it, worth it for this one moment, to give this one person this chance to free themselves of the shame that they were
Yeah.
associating with the thing that they did.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things I was just sort of like thinking about in general, like how did the idea of turning it into a podcast? Because I have to imagine it was like scary to make the effort. Like, how did that part of it come about?
So at True Crime Podcast Festival Austin this past year, I met the Landrys, which, if y'all don't know, Jason went missing in 2020, I think. Yeah,
Yeah,
2020.
December of 2020.
2020.
Yeah.
And Luling, Texas, and me and him had mutual friends. So the day he went missing, his face was flooding my Instagram feed. But we had mutual friends, and so getting to meet his parents and tell them how much of an impact that their son had on me was really important to me. And it got me thinking, like, okay, Jason went missing driving home from college, which every single kid does, which I've done a million times. This could have been prevented somehow, some way.
Mm.
And I wanted to be able to give people safety tips while traveling and give families a chance to tell their story and tell us about their loved one. And
Is this what inspired your first episode? Like your first few episodes had great advice around some of these topics on that.
yeah, so I really wanted to focus on like a good safety aspect, because I feel like if Jason knew to share his location with his dad or something, like before he left, that somehow this could have been prevented and he would still be here with his parents.
Mm.
And I didn't want any other child or teenager or college student going missing. And I realized there's no other Gen Z podcaster in the true crime space. And I was like, okay, there's nobody else here. I'm here already. I already know all these people. Why not just do it? So I jumped in. I couldn't think of a name. And then I was rewatching Law and Order SVU and organized crime. And Olivia got a compass from Elliot. And I was like, true compass. That's it.
That's perfect. That's perfect. Because I think that there's something to that idea that people today feel as if they don't have a compass. They don't have something pointing them in a direction, like their own values. They don't even necessarily know what they are.
Or like people can't trust their gut
instincts.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. That maybe it's pointing them in a direction, but they don't trust that's the right way to ultimately go. I'm curious, what have some of your favorite episodes or interviews been on the podcast?
My interview with the Landrys, first and foremost. That one was really important to me. And then I also did an interview with Brett Cross, who lost his son in Uvalde. That one broke my heart to do.
And that was was that 2021 shooting at the school in Uvalde? Yeah.
Yeah. And that one was just so hard to do.
He was one of the fathers, or?
Yeah, he lost his son.
Yeah.
But being from Texas, if you are from Texas, you know of the Frio in Garner State Park, and Uvalde is just right outside of that. It's a beautiful part of Texas. It's where I learned how to dance, like line dancing and two-stepping and stuff. So it's a really special place for a lot of Texans. My mom crashed her motorcycle out there and almost died, so holds a really special place in my heart. So whenever I heard the shooting had happened, I knew something had to change. And I know that not a lot of our friends have covered mass shootings, and it's really important to me. So I wanted to definitely cover Uvalde, especially because of how much that part of Texas means to me, and because of those kids. There were 19 kids that died that day, and I wanted to honor them.
Right. 19 that just didn't need to on so many levels.
And
so
two teachers. And two teachers. So, yeah.
Well, I appreciate what you're doing. I think that we need voices that care that much. I think that, in all the debate about whether true crime podcasting or all sorts of things. Journalism goes through this periodically, our entertainment or not. Like, I think that at the end of the day, whatever it is, empathetic, compassionate people who are more focused on doing something good than their own fame or something along those lines are critical.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially with such delicate cases like Uvalde and Jason Landry, who's still missing. Like his parents don't know where he is. And yeah, I have a big heart for those people.
Yeah, and handling their cases with care, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to make sure that because I've seen a ton of TikToks of other true crime podcasts getting the story wrong and the family speaking out about it, and I didn't want to be that person. So
Yeah. And even, details that are true. One of the things that I learned in journalism was that you don't have to share every detail. You share the relevant details. And when a detail will do more harm than good and isn't central to the story, it might be salacious, it might add more color, but the ethical thing to do is if it's not necessary and it causes more harm than good, to not use it. And I think those, like when we talk about like true crime ethics or ethics in general when it comes to publishing things or sharing or communicating it, I think some of it can get wrapped up in the idea of like advocacy or not advocacy or advocacy or journalism. But I think in all of it, whether you're an advocate, an entertainer, or a journalist, like just try to do more good than harm.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm starting comedy pretty soon, and
Oh, nice.
yeah, one of the comedians I've been having as like a mentor told me about the economy of words and how to use less words in a set. And I was thinking about that with true crime too. You can use less words to tell a story and still get your point across. Um, but
Sometimes even more powerfully.
yeah, so what I wanted to do with my podcast is not necessarily focus on the crime, but focus on who that person, if there was a victim, or if there is a living family member who can tell us a little bit more about that person while they were here so we can humanize them and not make it about entertainment and make it about get to knowing our people that we lost and remembering them. I think that's really important.
I was going to ask you, just as we're getting to wrap up, like one of the things that really strikes me about what you've said is like you're trying to bring knowledge into the world to help people essentially, whether it's keep them safe or any other form of sort of helping them. But they're like, when I think of and I listen to your story, in a lot of ways, you're like a survivor, right? Like you were a victim of some things. And I don't know whether you see it that way, but certainly from my chair, it feels like this. And then there were caretakers. And there were caretakers in your life who were supportive, like the teachers you described, and helpful, like the mentors that you've
Yeah.
described. And then there were caretakers who were not. And I was wondering, as we sort of wrap up, I wanted to give you a chance to share any closing thoughts. But one thing that I'm curious about is what message would you have to people who are in those roles, like caretakers or people who may not be sure that they're being treated in a appropriate or fair like way? Like what message would you have for them?
Take care of yourself first and foremost. Don't try to focus on making anybody else's life better because you deserve to make your life better. And just be there for people. If somebody reaches out randomly, message them back. You never know what they'll need, especially if you know somebody who may be going through a hard time or has chronic illness or mental health issues. Just be there for them. That's really what I ask of people.
I hear you. That's a great message. Well, thanks again. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your story. It's powerful. I appreciate you being so open and so vulnerable. I think people just hearing your words and hearing you talk like this will not only give them hope about things and a new way of thinking things, but, you may be surprised about the number of people who see you showing this kind of strength through humility and vulnerability, who realize like they can make it through whatever they're going through. And, we may never hear from that person. They may never email us or write us. They might, but I have no doubt that they're out there and they're listening right now and they feel a little more hope and strength because of you.
That's all I hope for, because I know I've been in a place where I thought the only way out was out. So if somebody decides to stick around and be here, I'm so grateful for that.
If you'd like to join us for more discussions with us and our listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including the listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook.